And I think, what I've come to see over these years is that in so many ways, it's really the love of the truth that is the fuel for this entire journey. The love of reality, a devotion or a fidelity, we might say, to reality itself, or to God, to Goddess, to Spirit, to the great mystery, to the beloved. And no matter whether we're talking about healing from trauma or relational wounding, integrating shadow parts or fragments and soul pieces, or repairing a fragile sense of self, borderline, narcissistic organization, or we're exploring the deeper layers of spiritual transformation, those felt states of communion, of union, of unity, of a unity with all that is. But to really live from this love of the truth, it takes effort and it takes attention and a certain sort of, maybe the most important word, it does require a certain sort of devotion. I know it's a strange word to use in our contemporary world, but a devotion to that, a real love of reality, to be in a conscious, embodied, compassionate relationship with each of the visitors of Psyche and Soma, with all of the guests, invited and uninvited, who make their way into the tavern of these bodies and nervous systems, into the sanctuary, really, of our hearts. Yeah, I mean, some of these visitors will be ones who were invited. The guest who carries joy or peace or a sense of meaning, a sense of aliveness, a sense of connectedness. And we can welcome those guests when they arrive, when they come knocking. And there will also be uninvited guests, perhaps these ones, who are holding and protecting the pieces of soul who have come to be associated with our unlived lives, the undigested grief, maybe in the belly, the sadness, the heartbreak, the shame, the rage, hiding out in our throats, in our faces, behind our eyes, in our tears. That historic core belief deep, deep in the psyche, in our cell tissue, that there's something wrong with me as I am, that I'm not okay. And we might start to see that these ones arrive in a moment of activation. There might be some trigger that we can point to. Someone looks at us the wrong way, doesn't see us the way we want to be seen. We experience some loss, some betrayal. These ones, we just might come to see that these ones who arrive in that moment, whether we can pinpoint the exact trigger of them or not, but they arrive not to harm, not to take us down, not to mess with us, not to obscure our realization, not as an obstacle on our path, but actually as the path itself, as an emissary of the path, as an ally of integration or of wholeness. And no, it's not always going to feel like that in the moment. Oh, the ally has arrived. This is amazing. Bring it on, more. Give me more activation. It's not always going to feel like that in the moment when these ones arrive. The truth is that it does take a certain cleansing of our perception, a polishing of our heart, a washing of the deep soma, in order to enter this new sort of relationship with the inner figures, with the pieces of soul, with the shadow elements, to really discover that they arrive not to harm, but to reveal. And that, in my experience anyway, that's not always going to feel at a feeling level. It's not always going to feel all that safe. We're not necessarily going to want to do this work, to turn toward that tenderness, that shakiness. It can all feel really counter-instinctual as we've spent so many years, decades, lifetimes, if we roll that way, developing and enacting strategies to keep us out of too much raw, naked, embodied vulnerability, which, as I've said before and will continue to say, was likely very intelligent. It was very adaptive to be able to do that at an earlier time in our lives, that capacity for sustained repressive activity, which comes online around the ages for most of us, 4, 5, 6, 7. Prior to that, we don't have that capacity to disown, to repress in that same way. And that's why trauma, wounding, betrayal, loss that occurs earlier in life, prior to the acquisition of those capacities, can be trickier to work with. But here we are now, and one of the core questions we might ask is, to what degree am I still in need of that sort of protection? Or do I have accesses to resources now, capacities that just weren't available then? And am I longing for something in my life that is maybe more alive, more creative, more connected, more whole, more naked and shimmering and magic and mysterious than maintaining that safety and protection that was once so essential? And, of course, there has to be a certain requisite amount of safety, in the body, in the nervous system. It has to be safe enough, put it that way. It's not just a free for all. I've tried that. But there has to be enough safety in order to turn toward the inner figures, toward the unlived life, toward the creative, pregnant, unknown, without being thrown so far out of our center that we have to engage those early, archaic, defensive systems of fight, flight, shutdown, freeze, collapse, dissociation. Because we can't do the work of illumination, of holding, of integration, if we're too far out of our window of tolerance. We have to go slow, micro moments of attunement, and to be really honest with ourselves about this, about our actual capacities in the moment. That's intelligent, and it's also just kind to do so, to not throw ourselves beyond our capacities, because that's only going to push us into a state of overwhelm, shutdown, collapse, anxiety, and for some of us, will evoke or trigger even a certain possibility of re-traumatization. And realize, that in some moments or in some periods in our lives, we'll privilege prioritize the embodiment of a felt sense of safety, or that's really the priority, that finding and discovering and emphasizing those resources of safety, is the most skillful, the most wise, the most compassionate action to take, especially, if we have any sort of history of traumatic or post traumatic stress, a fragile sense of self, or that may have arisen out of those early environments of narcissistic or borderline or traumatic organization and one of our caregivers, or for whatever reason. We don't always know. And yeah, and then at other times, when there is that baseline, not perfect, but that baseline level of safety, of inner space, we might call it, a real holding and containment that we can access, we can open up a bit then, right? And not so much privilege, prioritize feeling safe at a feeling level. And then we can engage with what is sometimes referred to as uncovering work, to use a psychoanalytic jargon, or shadow work, where there's enough ground and enough capacity where we can really stay with these difficult feelings in the body, where we can turn toward the inner figures, the images, the memories, the arousal, where we, can crank up the heat, so to speak, in the alchemical vessel, where there's enough space and enough capacity to access, to feel, to stay with, to make sense of, and to integrate material which maybe has been out of reach for a really long time, and usually for very intelligent reasons. And of course, there's likely to be some hesitation around that, a shakiness, a trepidation, like, I'm not so sure about all that, that I can do this, that I can turn back into into the unlived, the undigested, the unprocessed, the unmetabolized, the frozen, the crystallized. I'm not sure I can do that. And I'm not sure that I can really hold those feelings in the body, that we may have spent our entire lives around, organized around not feeling. We all have one or two feeling states that we'll do just about anything to avoid. And in fact, we've been spending our entire adult lives organizing our experience, our relationships around not having to experience those feelings. But as we invite or turn toward, that, there can be a real survival level sort of anxiety or a certain kind of panic around that. And that's to be expected. That makes sense. I mean, how could it not be? It's not a sign that, oh, I failed again, or something's wrong with me, or I'm just horribly unevolved or unspiritual, or all the rest of the chatter that has no basis in neurophysiological or spiritual reality. And as always, we have to go slow, one micro moment at a time, as we begin to recontact that tenderness, that sensitivity in psyche and soma, which was repressed, disowned, dissociated, split off from, for a very good reason. Not because I'm some neurotic, unevolved mess of a person. That's why I got split off. But in order to protect myself, it's the best way we knew at that time in our lives, which can be continuing into today, to take care of myself. It's an early form of self care, of self compassion, and it can be honored and it can be respected as such. While at the same time, of course, opening to the possibility that now may just be the time for a revisioning of all of that, a reimagining of all of that. And we'll have to take the experiment and make the journey ourselves and see what the realities of that are.